All right. Well, welcome. You know, like everything in the Albany Pine Bush, balance is really critical, and that bears it. That goes with all of the management that we do, the research that we do, our attempts and to work with private landowners around the landscape to continue building the preserve toward that 5,380 acre goal. And in this slide, which was taken by Gary Gold, donated to us, you can see what some people refer to as Mount Trashmore, but you can see the Greater Albany landfill there in the center of that slide, and it's surrounded by on to the right of the landfill, or on the south side of the landfill. You can see both the east and westbound lanes of the thruway, and in the foreground, you can actually see the preserve, and specifically, you can right through the middle left-hand side of the slide there. You can see the Blue Trail through Connor Barron's East, so to give you a sense of what we're looking at. But that is the Albany landfill, and the landfill actually has a couple of different parts that we'll talk about. But the landfill is one of the biggest fragmenting features in the pine bush landscape. It not only in the greater landscape itself, but specifically with the preserve. There's preserve land both east and west of the landfill, and that nearly 200 acres between the landfill and the adjoining trailer park separated the Connor Barron's East section of the preserve from the Wrap Barrens. And as you're looking toward downtown, so you can see the skyscrapers there of downtown Albany, looking toward the Hudson River in the background of this particular picture. So what I wanted to do tonight was walk through some of the ways that the Commission is working with the City of Albany and the New York State DEC to balance solid waste management in the landfill specifically with the biodiversity conservation in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. Now, hopefully many of you have seen this map before, and don't worry too much about the legend on the right. But this shows you the preserve currently. So the yellow line outlines 13,000 acres, or 12,999 acres to be exact, of the Albany Pine Bush study area. And that is bound on the north by Route 5, or Central Avenue, in the town of Colony and in the village of Colony. On the east, you have Fuller Road, and you can see in the lower right-hand corner of that map is SUNY Albany. And kind of in the center bottom, you can see the Crossgates Mall. The southern boundary of the study area is Western Avenue, or Route 20. And then it goes up Route 146 and snakes its way around to the thruway and to the Schenectady border, the border between Albany and Schenectady County, and the Woodlawn Preserve, which is that yellow star asterisk-shaped thing at the very top of that map. So within this 13,000 acres, there are about 6,000 acres of open space, 3,350 acres of which are protected in the preserve. So we talk about the Albany Pine Bush. So talking about the Albany Pine Bush is kind of like talking about the Adirondacks or the Catskills, right? So it's a place name. It's a generic name to a landscape, and within that landscape, there are lots of different things. So within the Albany Pine Bush, of course, we have the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, and the preserve is the darkest green shading there. It looks a bit like an odd-shaped jigsaw puzzle. And it's the darkest green, and you can see there's green with lines on it. I don't know if you can see my cursor. But that's the current 3,350 acres of the preserve. So it's a work in progress, right? The preserve isn't done yet. We are still working with the 3 municipalities and with willing landowners and developers to try and add land to the preserve. And you can see here the preserve is within the city of Albany, and this white line here is the city boundary. Then to the north, you have the village and the town of Colony, and then the town of Guilderland to the southwest. And this lime green shading throughout this map are the areas that are recommended for full protection that we would like to see added to the preserve someday. But specifically what we want to talk about tonight is here within the city of Albany. Denise, I can see you. Can you see my mouse moving? Okay, thanks, Mike.
Yes.
You're nodding your head. Okay, so this is the Albany landfill. Again, some people affectionately call it Mount Trashmore. But the Albany landfill is this massive fragmenting feature in the preserve between Connor Barron's East and the Discovery Center is right about here at the tip of my cursor. So this is Connor Barron's East. You have the landfill, and then you have the rat barrens over here. Here's Rap Road and Rensselaer Lake. And if you look at this map, you know, there are lots of fragmenting features on this landscape, but the landfill is by far one of the biggest. And immediately adjacent to the landfill to the north is this old mobile home park. It used to be a mobile home. So you guys have volunteered enough with the preserve to appreciate that there are lots of challenges to trying to create and manage the preserve. Putting fire on the ground, dealing with invasive species, collecting enough native seed to be able to do the restoration work that we want to do, cutting trees, mowing, all of that stuff. But in the long term, outside of our ability to, you know, managing the site with fire, landscape fragmentation is really the single largest obstacle to meeting our goals for building and managing a viable preserve. Plants and animals need to move, right? Nutrients need to move, water needs to move. When you fragment a landscape like this, you can inhibit the ability for animals and plants to move, inhibit the ability for fire to work effectively, and inhibit nutrient availability. So there are lots and lots of impacts and implications for taking a piece of open space and chopping it up into pieces like this. Not the least of which, of course, are invasive species. You create lots of edge when you divide something up like this, and all those edges are much more vulnerable to invasion from non-native invasive plants than the middles of the preserve. But the landfill itself is this massive fragmenting feature, and that's what we're going to spend a few minutes talking about. I'm not sure, is that text covered up by what I'm looking at here? Okay, so you guys can see that text. Sorry, I have all right, so this is the landfill close up, and if you look at this, you can see the landfill kind of circled in that yellow outline. The green outline is the former mobile home park. Sorry, the dog is playing with a toy right behind me. In 2005, the city of Albany put in an application to expand the landfill again. I believe that was their 4th expansion of the Albany landfill, and that's highlighted in that red oval. Highlights the area that the city wanted to and was subsequently approved to expand the landfill to create new landfill space. So that was a 15-acre area. They also have a 23-acre overfill area. So they're actually expanded the landfill on top of itself, on top of it, the edge of the older landfill. And so creating all of this additional landfill space, smack dab in a globally rare nature preserve, has lots of impacts. One, of course, the habitat is lost in the area where the expansion would occur. And in this case, that was both some upland, a little bit of pitch pine scrub oak forest on a dune, as well as a good-sized piece of a very old red maple hardwood swamp. Expanding the landfill adds additional habitat fragmentation. There are lots of other, you guys, if you've been in the preserve and you've driven around, you've noticed some of these impacts of air pollution, whether it's occasional odors, or whether it's, you know, the actual fumes from the equipment and the off-gassing of the landfill itself generates some pollutants into the air. The potential for water pollution, surface runoff in particular, but also the potential for groundwater contamination if the liner is not appropriately sealed. There's a lot of noise impacts. If you've walked the yellow trail in the preserve, which actually comes out right here by these ponds now, is the yellow trail. You can frequently hear the vehicles backing up, running over and managing the landfill. There are, of course, the visual impacts. You can see it from the yellow trail. You can see it from lots of places. It's so tall now. And the other impacts is from an expanded, bigger landfill is that it really complicates management. In particular, it provides for the additional introduction of non-native invasive plants and animals. Right? You've got trucks and equipment coming from all over the region coming to this landfill. And all the edges of the landfill are great places for all of those plants to grow. And of course, the landfill has impacts on trail use, and the landfill has potential impacts on fire management. In particular, the off-gassing from a landfill produces methane. So if we're doing a prescribed fire next to a landfill, we want to make sure there's no methane in the air. So the landfill works with us to check that before we do any burns. But there are a laundry list of impacts to the preserve from an expanded landfill. So when the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation provided the city of Albany with their permit in 2009, they required a number of measures to offset some of those impacts. One was they increased the tipping fee. So tipping fee is what haulers, what someone bringing garbage into the landfill pays to dump. That's called the tipping fee, and a small portion of that goes to the commission to help with preserve management. That's one way they offset impacts. Another is for this particular expansion, since they were expanding the landfill and removing habitat, they had to protect some additional land. So there were three small parcels within the preserve, within the pine bush, that were added to the preserve that the city of Albany purchased as a requirement of their permit. And then lastly, what we're going to spend this evening talking about is the restoration of nearly 255 acres around and on the landfill itself. And if you notice on this map, again, I had the landfill highlighted, but I also have the old Fox Run Mobile Home Park highlighted. So when this project started, that's what it looked like. It was still an active mobile home park with streets and utilities and septic tanks and houses and landscaping and all the rest. So specifically that restoration that the city is required to do as part of their permit is to create 20 additional wetland acres, create and restore 3,200 linear feet of stream, restore and enhance 34 additional wetland acres, and restore nearly 200 acres of upland communities to various pine barrens habitats. So as a result of that, and the working collaboratively with the commission and DEC, the city of Albany hired Clough Harbor and Associates and Applied Ecological Services as an ecological consultant from Wisconsin, who has experience with this kind of project. And what they propose, this is the schematic of the restoration associated with the Albany landfill. So again, around the landfill, again, you have all this white space to the east, to the west here, is Corner Barrens East. That's the preserve. And then this was the old former mobile home park and the big open weedy field that was associated with that parcel, and other parcels that have been added and acquired as part of the preserve, much of which is owned by New York State DEC. So what the city is actually required to do is restore all of this habitat to bridge that gap and actually get rid of and reduce fragmentation in the landscape. You can see here these dark swaths, there's wetlands, these are some additional stream channels. The tan color here are various pitch pine scrub oak barrens communities. This green is pitch pine and oak forest, all the way around the landfill, around the north side of the landfill, connecting Corner Barrens East to Rapp Road, which then, of course, there's the Rapp Barrens on the east side of Rapp Road, southeast side of Rapp Road. But additionally, if you look here, they are also required to restore the capped and closed landfill when it's closed to native pine bush plants and native pine barrens communities. And if that's successful, they will have effectively, even though it will still be a landfill underneath it, it'll have a veneer of native plants and provide some habitat for wildlife. And specifically, here's the final restoration plan for the landfill itself. And the landfill is really, well, it's like 4 parts now, but we'll say it's 2. So this western end here that juts out toward the preserve, toward Corner Barrens East, that's called the Greater Albany Landfill. And that was closed a little over a decade ago. So that's been closed and capped for a while, but covered in grass and cold season lawn grass, basically turf grass, and mowed throughout the year. Doesn't really provide a whole lot of habitat for wildlife. The rest of the landfill here, the bigger mountain, if you're familiar with topographic maps, the way this looks, they're showing you the topo lines here, is the current active cell and where the expansion is. So the overlay or the overfill of the landfill is this whole eastern side of the landfill. And that's a little over 150 acres or so. And the plan is that when all is said and done, the landfill is closed and capped, they'll restore this to native plant communities. The yellow being the native grassland community, the northern sandplain, yeah, the native pine bush grassland, successional northern sandplain grassland. There we go. And then surrounding that will be pitch pine scrub oak barrens and pitch pine scrub oak thickets. And along the thruway as a buffer, this blue shading here will be pitch pine oak forest. So there'll be more of a forested treed buffer between the landfill and the thruway. And this is going to be a project that's going to be phased over the course of many years. Currently this year, they're beginning working on capping and restoring the greater Albany land. But the restoration at this scale, this is a whole different animal. This is above and beyond anything the commission has attempted before. Because initially what the city did is they came in and removed, there were a handful of residents still left in the mobile home park. Those folks were provided an incentive and decided to move and are living elsewhere. So the initial phases of the project were to restore the habitat around the landfill itself. So that meant ripping up all of those utilities, the streets, the pavement, the power lines, sewer and water lines, etc. Regrading all of that, not only to remove the material that was there, but to restore historical small dunes that were there. And you can see all of these are little depressions in a stream corridor where they did a lot of heavy work with excavators to basically recontour the whole site and create wetlands that I'll show you in a minute. Wetlands and dunes. I mentioned they had to restore 3,200 feet of linear stream. Now, I don't know if you saw those pop up, but there are the two stream corridors that feed both the north and the south arm of Rensselaer Lake. And this formerly, before the landfill expansion and this restoration project, this upper stream was non-existent. This lower stream was basically just a straight line ditch that flowed out of that open water pond by the Yellow Trail, straight down along the edge of the landfill and eventually into this DEC wetland and then into the lake. And because it was a straight line ditch, it created all kinds of problems with erosion and sedimentation and nutrient enrichment in the lake itself. So that old ditch is gone, and now what they did is they restored two meandering streams. The lower stream is pretty much permanent, always has flowing water in it. The northern stream is more ephemeral. It has water in it in the spring, but in the summer and fall, it's pretty dry. One of the other neat things and innovative things that Applied Ecological Services brought to this project was when this red maple hardwood swamp was removed to build the next cell of the landfill, they dug up a lot of the roots. So they cut the trees down, but they dug up the root balls, and then replanted those root balls into the new streams. And that did a number of things. One, it helped jumpstart, right, red maple will resprout. So it helped jumpstart some woody plant growth. But also with that root ball came lots of other great stuff. So beneficial fungi, soil bacteria, seeds and roots of other native plants. So literally they used the stumps of those dug up stumps and root balls of those old trees to seed that stream corridor with plants and with essential native soil biota. The other thing they needed, and that was kind of innovative with this project, is they needed sand and seed. The sand in particular is needed for the landfill. When a landfill is typically closed, it's only covered on top of its cap with 6 to 8 inches of topsoil. And then it's seeded with turf grass, which generally has a root depth of 3 or 4 or 5 inches at most. Not very deep at all. Native pine bush plants really need to be in sand. So one of the challenges of this project was for the City of Albany to be able to acquire enough sand to cap the landfill. And as you know, I always say the serendipity of pine bush never ceases to amaze me. SUNY Nano College down at Fuller Road by SUNY Albany was expanding. And I don't know if you remember, about 5-6 years ago, they moved Washington Avenue Extension and removed a large dune. They donated all of that sand to the City of Albany for this restoration project, and which is actually more than enough sand for what the city needs to be able to cap and restore the landfill when they're done putting solid waste in the landfill. So we have the sand. The other thing they really needed for the landfill and for the, for all 200 and some odd acres of this project was enough of the native seed. And this is, some of you may have done this with us in the past, but going out and helping collect seed. So the folks that work with Clough Harbor and Associates and Applied Ecological Services are collecting seed from within a 50-mile radius of the preserve of over 200 plants for this 200 different species for this restoration project. A wide variety of wetland plants as well as the typical pitch pine, scrub oak, barrens plants. But additionally, they're taking some of that seed and they established a native plant nursery in a portion of the former mobile home north of the landfill. And if you've been out there, you may have seen, it used to have fence around it to keep the deer out when these plants were getting established. But it's about 2.5, almost 3 acres, where they took some of that seed that they collected from that 50-mile radius and established propagation beds, dense beds of native plants, specifically for the purpose of generating seed for the restoration project. So some seed is commercially available, like little blue stem, dotted horse mint, round-headed bush clover. Ernst Conservation Seed and other companies have our local genetics of some of those plants. But things like lupin are not really commercially available. Butterfly milkweed is commercially available, but not from the Albany pine bush genetics. The same with some of these other species. So for about a dozen species, they established this 2.5-acre nursery that they actively and aggressively manage like a nursery to maximize flower production and seed production. Then every year for the last 10 now, they've been collecting seed off of these plots. And a lot of that, planting it out as they need it. But so getting the sand and getting the seed was really critical to the success of this project. And this is, again, what it looks like now. The landfill is not done yet, but for all intents and purposes, the main lift of the restoration around the landfill to bridge the gap between Hunter Barrens East on the northwest here and Rapp Road Barrens and Rapp Road on the east is done. And it is this phenomenal mix of upland and wetland communities. And if you've walked the Yellow Trail, now that it's been rerouted, it walks right along this boundary. So you can really get a look at it. And if you've been hiking in the preserve for a while, you maybe have noticed the transformation out there. The landfill itself, though, that's a different animal. This is the conceptual plan for the landfill, and they're just now beginning to initiate that plan. But we're seeing really positive progress. So the wetlands are doing well, and they've established a good deal of lupin throughout the site. We'll talk more about lupin in a minute. But it's working. It's not a cookie cutter. It's not a garden. It's not a manicured, landscape with, hard edges. They really did a nice job of blending these upland and wetland communities into this matrix that not only bridges the gap between Hunter Barrens East and Rapp Road, but also creates really nice wildlife corridors for both wetland and upland plant and animal species. You've probably seen some of that view of the landfill with a fence from the Yellow Trail. You've been out there. But lupin is one of the critical plants, right? I mean, you guys know this from the work that we're doing in the preserve. And to recover the Corner Blue, lupin's a staple of the preserve. Similarly, throughout the restoration project, they've been planting lupin. And I want to show you a couple of things here. I don't know if you can notice this yellow stippled kind of shading. Those are all the areas within the restoration area around the north side of the landfill that support lupin and now support Corner Blue butterflies. But additionally, I want to draw your attention to the landfill itself. Can you see this on the Greater Albany landfill, this stippled yellowish rectangle with the green border? Hopefully you guys can see that. So not a lot of people, I think pretty much almost no one, has successfully restored a closed and capped landfill to native pine barrens plants, right? They're just simply, right, there are fewer than 20 known pine barrens in the world. And I think we're one of the few that has a landfill smack dab in the middle of it. So that yellow rectangle on the closed landfill are test plots where the city's consultants set out to test various strategies for getting native plants established on a landfill. And one of the questions we had was, how much sand do we need? How deep? And what's the chemistry like? Here's another view. Again, I just blew up and zoomed in on that photo that Gary Gold provided us. But if you can see this patch of tall grass here that straddles the closed portion of the landfill, you can see the preserve again is in the foreground. That's 4 acres of test plots that they seeded. They laid down various depths of sand of various pH, and then seeded the whole thing the same way to look at and try and study how difficult or easy is it going to be to get native plants to germinate and grow and get established on top of a great big pile of trash. And I just want to draw your attention to the bottom of this slide, because I hope you can see that. So one of the things that AES noticed that we did not know before was that, right, so the SUNY Nano dug up that whole massive dune and gave them all that sand. So the city tested it to see how the soil chemistry tested relative to sands in high quality pitch pine scribble barrens in the preserve. Is it the right sand? Texture wise, it's the right sand. Chemistry wise, it looked good. But what they noticed was the top 4 to 6 feet of the sand was what we would expect. Highly acidic, typical pine bush sand, pH around 5. What we didn't know and what they discovered was that as you get deeper into that dune, the soil chemistry changes dramatically, and it becomes almost neutral. So it goes from a pH of 5 to like a pH of nearly 7. So they call that the high pH sand. So they wanted to test. They had a lot of that high pH sand. So they wanted to test not only what soil depths do we need on the landfill, but also, is there any utility to that higher pH sand relative to what we typically find in the pine bush? Long story short, after 6 years of study, they've determined that while the native plants were quick to germinate and get established in all of these sands, the shallower depths of sand and the high pH sand was much more susceptible to invasion by native plants or by invasive plants than native. So the native plants that they seeded initially got established, but then over time were outcompeted by non-native invasive plants. In particular, the higher pH sand really gave the non-native invasive plants a competitive advantage. So now what they're going to be looking at doing across the whole landfill based on that research is mixing 18 to 24 inches of sand, it's going to vary, across the landfill as a medium to plant the native plants in when the landfill closes. And again, that was a whole separate massive research project that the city paid their consultants to do. And it was good that they did that. We learned a lot. So now we know what the city knows what needs to happen on the landfill to meet the specifications of their permit and restore the capped landfill to native pine bush plant communities. But the other thing that the city's consultants are doing a lot of, they have an extensive monitoring program out there. So again, I appreciate this. May look a little weird. So this is again a map of the landfill. On the lower half of that map, and the upper half is the earlier phases of the restoration project. And this illustrates all of the monitoring. So all of those orange lines that you see are labeled, T9, going from right to left. T9, T1, T2, T11. Those are transects. So those are transects that they walk throughout the spring, summer, and fall, looking for insects and reptiles and amphibians, as well, and plants. They have a whole separate project for monitoring the plants out there. All the dots you see with the B's next to them, B9, B10, B17, you got B2, B1 up here. Those are breeding season bird point counts. They monitor breeding season birds during the day, in the morning. They have a nocturnal birding program. They're looking at woodcock and whippoorwill, much like the way that we do. They do breeding bird surveys. They do spring migration surveys. They do fall migration surveys. Those nocturnal bird surveys. Insects, plants, reptiles, and amphibians. And where am I? The T's. See, you can see these TA. Here's TA1. It's trapping array 1. There's trapping array 2, trapping array 3. Those are pitfall traps with drift fence that they set up that they monitor to catch reptiles and amphibians. So they'll open them, they'll be open overnight, and they'll check them in the morning. And that's because so many rare animals are located around the landfill. And they found things like hognose snakes moved in, and spadefoot toads, and spotted turtles, and all kinds of if you build it, they will come kind of a thing. The native animals have moved in. But they have an extensive monitoring program on the landfill. And the best part of that monitoring program is that it started before any restoration work began. They established these trapping arrays, they established these transects, and started surveying before they disturbed the former mobile home park or that wetland that's now landfill. And their monitoring has picked up a number of really cool things. Some species that we don't typically see in the pine bush shut, like a pair of red-headed woodpeckers. They find species that we hope they would find, and their restoration program is targeted. This is a frosted elfin. These guys are flying right now out in the preserve. Little brown butterfly, but if you look, it's got this frosting across the back, but you see that black dot or the back of the wing. That's how you know it's a frosted elfin. And that is a New York State threatened butterfly that feeds only on wild blue lupin. And of course, Carner blues. So here's a Carner blue on lupin in the restoration project. And Carner blues made it out there right away. Within a couple of years, Carner blues started showing up on the lupin that they had planted in low numbers. So we then helped them and released as part of our program of accelerated colonization, we released I think about 1,000 Carner blue butterflies out there in the former mobile home park. And this is where they find Carner blues now. There are Carner blues up in the test plot on the landfill, and there are Carner blues every place else that they've planted lupin and done restoration work out there. So it's helping us with our recovery efforts, but this is also demonstrating that their habitat restoration work around the landfill is indeed bridging the gap between Carner Barrens East and Rapp Road. And they found a lot of other cool animals and rare animals. This is a mottled dusky-winged skipper. This skipper, supposedly it's not a butterfly or a moth, it's a skipper, but it looks like a butterfly. Mottled dusky wings as caterpillars feed exclusively on New Jersey tea. So this is one of those animals that's kind of indirectly dependent on wildland fire, because naturally it's the heat of a fire that cracks the seed coat on New Jersey tea seeds so that they can germinate. So as a caterpillar, it's the same way as Carner blues only feed on lupin leaves. Mottled dusky-winged skippers only feed on the leaves of the New Jersey tea. And this was a real find. We dropped everything and went out to see this bird, and I was glad that we got to see it. This bird had not been seen in the preserve for almost 70 years. The last known documented yellow-breasted chat in the pine bush was in 1956. Yellow-breasted chat is the largest warbler in North America. They're actually contemplating that it's a tanager, putting it in with the tanagers. But this is a bird that used to be common based on the literature in this landscape. And we have not seen it, but it showed up in their restoration work. And this is the Applied Ecological Services field zoologist, Mike McGraw. And Mike was thrilled to find an adult female hognose snake out in the restoration area. And you can see the landfill and the fence up behind him. So again, what was a mobile home park and an old weedy field is now native habitat that native animals are moving into. Those wetlands are full of, this is a Jefferson's blue-spotted salamander cross. We don't know that we have any pure blue-spotted salamanders, but that's about as close as we can get. So the wildlife have come back. The wildlife are moving in. Okay. Can't see my notes here. So that's kind of the extent of the presentation I wanted to give, but there are a few takeaways that I hope you would take from this presentation. One is that habitat restoration is a process, not an event. We are about, depending on the start date, the restoration project started in 2009. So we're now more than a decade, 11 years into this project, and it's still only just begun. The work is the restoration work. The restoration phase, I should say, is largely done around the landfill. Now they're in a very aggressive maintenance phase, in particular managing invasive plants while the native plant community gets established. And we've begun initiating prescribed fire into that area north of the landfill. And the restoration of the landfill itself is starting this summer with the city will begin moving sand from the stockpiles on Rapp Road to the base of that old Greater Albany landfill as they begin to work from the bottom up in the restoration process of the landfill. The city's efforts to date have been very successful in restoring habitat and reducing fragmentation, which was the point of the mitigation, right, that the DEC required of them. Longer term, our management will play a significant role in the future success of this project. And it's worth mentioning, based on the permit, the city is responsible for another 10 years on that area around the north of the landfill, and at least another 20 or 30 years for the landfill itself. While the land around the landfill that they've been working on is part of the preserve, the landfill itself is not. And nor do we anticipate that the landfill would ever be part of the preserve. So it'll be landscaped and have native plants on it. And we'll work with the city to develop some sort of an arrangement for helping them managing the vegetation in the landfill longer term. But we don't envision the landfill itself ever being part of the preserve. Ecosystem restoration and mitigation is benefiting rare wildlife, which is one of the points of the mitigation package that the DEC required of the city to get their permit to expand the landfill. We're seeing the wildlife moving in, and the plant communities develop nicely. And monitoring wildlife is really our best window into the restoration process. That's because there is really no reference community for inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens. What we inherited when we started this project, when we started the preserve, was a pitch pine scrub oak barrens that was already very degraded. But what we do have, we also don't have a lot of good data on what the pine bush used to be from a vegetation perspective. But we have an awful lot of good historical data on the wildlife communities. So by monitoring the wildlife, we can look at the distribution and abundance of those wildlife that depend on pitch pine scrub oak barrens and let them tell us if we're moving things in the right direction. And lastly, and I kind of want to end on the point that I started with, which is, everything in the pine bush is about balance. And collaboration in this case has really yielded some phenomenal results. This project, the landfill restoration project, yes, the city has to do it as a result of a permit. But really, it's a collaboration, and it's the result of the collaboration between the city, the New York State DEC, and the commission to try and balance and reduce the impacts of the landfill, which the city needs the landfill. The folks of the region need this landfill. But simultaneously, we're trying to manage this globally rare biodiversity. It's not a question of doing one or the other. It's like always, it's a question of doing both things wisely. And by working together, we've been able to develop a pretty creative strategy for meeting everyone's needs to the greatest extent that we can. So collaboration is really essential. And I guess that's all I had. I'd be happy to, with whatever time we have left, I would be happy to answer any questions or try to answer any questions you folks may have.